as I was in the process of editing the video that I'm going to post today, I actually I was reading through a book called The River of Consciousness by Oliver Sacks, who was a famous neurologist and died not too long ago. He's one of the more famous brain scientists. And it kind of made me think about what I had already talked about. So I'm just adding this first part of the video. The majority of the videos to come, and you'll know because I'm wearing a different sweater. But I just wanted, the video that's going to follow is about why I don't seek to learn other systems other than postural restoration. And of course, the reason being that only postural restoration sees an underlying pattern of right dominance behind pain, behind idiopathic pain that doesn't have any obvious origins, such as an injury, a sickness, an illness, blunt trauma, things of that nature. So, but to start it off, because a lot of people will say, well, why does no one else notice this? Or if this is so obvious, why do doctors not know this? Why do other health professionals are not aware of this pattern if to PRI people it's so obvious? So there was a couple of things that I read in this book that made me think of that question, because I don't have a great answer for you. It just is what it is. But so he talks about how in the 1960s, when he was starting his career, or early in his career, he worked with people with headaches. And about 1 in 20 of his patients, which is a significant amount, experience before their migraine headaches, they experience like a floating, not just a floating, but like geometric figures that are twirling in their visual space. And he couldn't find any literature on this whatsoever until he found something from the 1860s by a British neurologist, Sick Headache and Some Allied Disorders, a contribution to the pathologies of nerve storms. That's what they were called back in the 1860s. And so he asks, how had these phenomena, startling, highly characteristic, unmistakably hallucinatory patterns, evaded notice for so long? And, for 100 years, no one reported on these issues. Like, they just kind of went away. And so first he says, in the first place, someone must make an observation and report it. Now, second of all, so, if no one reports this observation that they're constantly seeing a pattern, if no one reports it or can make sense of it, then it's not going to really diffuse into the medical community. So that's one issue. And then he brings up muscular dystrophy, which we've all probably heard of. And it was in 1858 that Guillaume Duchesne, a French neurologist, published a detailed description of a boy with what we now call muscular dystrophy, followed a year later by a report on 13 more cases. His observations rapidly entered the mainstream of clinical neurology, identified as a disorder of great importance. So this disorder had always existed, ubiquitous and unmistakable, but very few physicians had reported on it before Duchesne. So, and then another woman says, how is it that a disease so common, so widespread, and so recognizable at a glance is recognized only now? Why did we need M. Duchesne to open our eyes? And that's the fascinating thing about this right dominant pattern. Even people who are not trained in PRI, just clients, once they see it, they see it. They're astounded that people aren't noticing this obvious gait pattern where people are constantly, how they're walking, they're constantly on the right side. They never transfer to the left. They see it in their faces. They see it in their feet. They know what to look for, and they see it, and they're just astounded that other people never picked up on it. So the medical community and the society in general has to be prepared for a new paradigm. And sometimes people just don't know what they're looking at. And other people, patterns have been described, but not like, especially in the frontal plane. A lot of people have seen, especially osteopathic doctors, have seen frontal plane shifts. And in the cranium, definitely. Actually, the cranial strain patterns that PRI talks about come from, the descriptions come from osteopathic medicine, but they just never recognize an underlying pattern of right dominance. And so I just wanted to start off the video with some passages from this book that could explain the phenomenon of why this right dominant pattern was never noticed before. People will often ask me why I don't learn other systems or other treatments for helping people in pain. And what they fail to realize is that there's a significant difference at the core of postural restoration compared to pretty much anything else. There are lots of great systems, if you want to call them systems, out there to help people get out of pain. And the difference, though, is that in postural restoration, there's an underlying understanding. There's an understanding that there's an underlying pattern inherent in all humans, just because of how we're built, because of the way that our organs are placed inside of us, and because of the influence of the much larger right diaphragm. It will make it easier for humans to stand on the right leg and breathe than it will on the left leg and breathe. And that our neurological function between the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere of the brain, which are not physically the same on both sides. There is an actual twist in the brain itself that causes the right hemisphere of the brain, the left hemisphere of the brain, not to be physically, structurally the same. And then, of course, there are divisions in neurological function, lots of overlap, obviously, but it is well known that the left and right side of the brain do not operate in the same way. So that asymmetry, these inherent asymmetries inside all of us, add up to produce an underlying pattern of right-sided dominance. Now, if I were to know that, that's PRI. That explanation, that observation that someone made, that the founder made many, many years ago, is the underlying foundation of the whole science. So if I accept that to be the truth, and this is what I've seen over and over and over and over again, and that's why when people do PRI, they start off on that journey, and it's like, wow, all these people that I'm testing, they keep coming out the same way. Now, are there variations? Yes, because there's pathology. And then there's that PEC. But underlying it, all of this, is still this left AIC, right BC pattern. And as long as you accept what the tests are telling you, what shoulder range of motion tests are telling you, what abduction tests are telling you, when you're testing these people's arms and legs, which is really telling you the position of their pelvis and their rib cage, and when you test their neck, and you see the same results over and over and over, indicating that a human is orienting their body unknowingly to the right. When you see that over and over and over and over again with everybody, and again, I know a lot of people say, no, I'm the opposite. I understand that, but there's plenty of people who think they're their opposite, and then once they start working with a PRI practitioner, they realize, no, I am the normal pattern. What you see often is compensations, not the underlying pattern beneath them. So if I accept that as the truth of how humans actually exist, why would I learn another system that's not seeking to resolve that underlying pattern of right dominance? Now, you're not going to resolve the pattern of underlying right dominance because we're always going to be right dominant. It's built into our structure. And again, that's what PRI is all about. But what you have to do is balance out that right dominance with a left side that can function normally. And just because we're right-sided dominant doesn't mean we're using the right side appropriately. So we need to relearn how to use both sides without compensation, because there's different compensations going on both sides. You don't have a right side that's functioning perfectly, and you definitely don't have a left side that's functioning perfectly, but those two sides have to complement each other. And when they don't, when both sides are completely dysfunctional, you end up in PEC land, or patho-PEC land. And then there's just various layers of dysfunction. So I'm not going to spend my time working or learning a way of a system, if you want to call it that, that doesn't take into account this underlying asymmetry of a dominant right side. So visually, if I bring this little diagram into it, if you think, let me lower it a little bit more. Most people are still believing that this picture right here, this perfectly symmetrical person, and it's a terrible drawing, I understand, but hopefully it gets the point across. If you see humans as this, which I did for the first 35 years of my life until I found PRI. This is what I assumed was how humans were, how we existed in the world. Symmetrical. You just assume symmetry. You don't assume asymmetry, but yet if you start to study it, you realize the humans are not symmetrical. We're simply not. Your brain's perception of your own being is not symmetrical. We are asymmetrical. I know, and this is in the scientific literature. I even did a video about this where you can see the drawing from a neurooptometry textbook. Humans have more right peripheral vision processing than on the left side. So we sense space to the right more than we do to the left. That's why I drew a wall right here. A lot of people, they don't have a physical wall next to the left side, but their brain does not perceive open space over there. So what happens? They stay over on that right side. If they're staying over on the right side, then they're going to have more body weight on the right foot. And so there's that arrow pressing down into the ground on the right. So humans inherently have more sense of right space and the ground on the right side. Why does that matter? Well, how else does your brain know where you're going or where you are? Your brain has to get you to move forward without getting hurt. That's pretty much, you can argue, and many scientists have, that the point of the human brain is to first, and the central nervous system is to first organize more complicated movement, but second of all, to get you moving forward without getting hurt. Because you need to move forward in life to get stuff. Once one animal or marine animal rolled over on its side and was able to move to get food, well, it had a competitive advantage over everything else. So the ability to move is to just not to move, it's to get stuff. It's for survival. Humans have to move. When we don't move, when we're sedentary, our bodies completely break down and we start dying young. So humans will have an inherent sense of space on the right and sense of ground on the right, and in fact, their whole right side of their body. In this position, we know the right side of the body is going to be more compressed. You'll see I made it a little bit thinner on the right side. That's because when you're on your right leg, that's what your body does. The right leg adducts, it moves in. The right rib cage moves down and in. And the right neck compresses. That's called the left AIC, right BC pattern. That's what we're talking about. You're going to have a tendency to overuse the neck muscles on the right side. You'll have a tendency to feel your right teeth, your right molars, more so than the left side. That's completely normal. Those are all things that occur in a right dominant human. You're more likely to put air into the upper right chamber of your anterior chest wall. You're likely to have a rib flare on the left side more so than on the right side. This left diaphragm is likely to be less domed. So that's not a great picture, but this left diaphragm has more of a tendency to be used as a postural stabilizer muscle, while the right side, because it's in more of a domed position, and I didn't really draw it perfectly, because it's in a more of a domed position on the right side, it's more likely to be used as a breathing muscle. The left leg is more likely to be abducted, again, externally rotated, moving out into space. The right leg is more likely to be internally rotated and adducted. Left legs often appear shorter, and yes, you can have a right leg that appears shorter, but that's not the norm. This is the norm. You find it quite often. The left leg but the left leg is not actually shorter. It's because of the pattern. It's because the left leg had to abduct and externally rotate in order to stay straight as we walk, because everything is turned to the right, so we have to counter-rotate back to the left to stay straight. So all of these things, the right side of your body is compressed into the ground, the left side is decompressed. These are all things that you find with people that you're testing constantly. This does not exist, especially after 13 years of age, when these patterns really start to show up. Why would I, or anybody, once they understand what this pattern is, why would we treat somebody like this? Why would you even lift weights as if you existed like this? Because you don't. If you exist like this, with a tendency to overuse the right side, regardless of how balanced you are, you're always going to want to use the right side a little bit more than the left. Why would I treat both sides the same? If this is not reality, and this is reality, and you realize that this sensory input of the outside world, the sensory input that your brain receives from the ground coming up through your foot, and the sensory input that your brain is receiving from itself because of this continuous feedback loop of sensing position of your body, all these things feed this dominant right side. Why would we treat the right side and the left side the same? So any system, if you want to call it a system, remember, I don't call PRI system. I call it the most accurate, at this point in time, the best and most accurate explanation of how humans breathe, stabilize, and move their bodies in time and space. It's the best explanation. And what are PRI techniques? They are explanations of how to inhibit or turn off that dominance on the right side when it needs to be turned off. The right side dominance has to be turned off when you're on your left side so that you can use your left side appropriately. Then it has to turn back on when you're on your right side. But if you're using right side dominance on your right leg and also on your left leg, and you don't change the patterns, you're never using two patterns. You're existing only in one state. So that is why I have no real interest. And yes, you may call me short-sighted, but if you understand what I was just talking about, then you kind of understand why I don't need to learn anything else. If you start with the belief that I already have, and what has been shown over and over, and I've never seen a right AIC patterned individual. I'm sorry. If they did, if you are a right AIC patterned individual and you insist that you are, then this channel has no meaning to you whatsoever, because everything I talk about is based on this recognition of an underlying right dominant human. If you had a bigger diaphragm on the left, which you probably don't, if you had a heart on the right, which you probably don't, although some people do, but I've never heard of the diaphragm being bigger on the left. If that actually occurred, then perhaps you would be a right AIC pattern individual, because you'll probably have a stronger pull of your lumbar spine to the left. But because we have bigger right diaphragms, that pull to the right is greater than it is to the left. So hopefully that explains why I personally don't see the reason to study other methods. Now, could things like massage, could things like any type of manual therapy help in resolving right-sided dominance so that you can get a left side also, and then you can alternate sides? If it helps, sure. If it helps in the outcome of the goal of PRI, then absolutely. But without recognition of the underlying pattern and seeking to resolve that patterning issue, I just don't see the value in it. If you find this video to be interesting or helpful, could you please subscribe to the channel, like it, share it, comment? Everything helps.